Okay. Yes, Silhouette of Virtue is a novel. It's a mystery novel, and it's set in the 1970s in a college town in Illinois. And in this town, there's a series of sexual assaults on students that targets young Asian girls. And Dr. Nathan Rivers, who's a philosophy professor there at the college, small college, um, tries to find out what's going on. And he's motivated because another African American instructor is accused of the crimes and arrested. And Dr. Rivers, who's also African American, feels that his colleague deserves a fair trial. And of course, this event polarizes the community. And he becomes sort of a amateur sleuth trying to find out um, who's really behind the crimes. And unfortunately, as soon as he starts to do that, he starts seeing evidence that his colleague, Duncan, African-American colleague, may in fact be implicated. Okay, I have a question about how my work in forensic psychology influenced my writing in this book. Well, my work as a psychologist, forensic psychologist, you see, especially in the kind of work I do, mainly working with people who've been very violent, serious offenders, violent offenders, sexual psychopaths. You try to basically create a story to understand this person and to understand what they did and why they did it. So you're putting together these pieces, and over time you run into many interesting, intriguing personalities, and they just by nature generate some interest. But I was also interested in this book to depict some types of psychopaths, some types that you would find over a career, because they're not all the same. You know, there's quite a bit of variety. And in fact, another example of that, it would be like Reservoir Dogs, that movie. If you ever seen that film, there's several types of psychopaths and antisocial types. They're not all the same. So that's one way it's influenced this book. There's a question about personalities. Are any of the characters in the book based on people I've actually dealt with? And I would say somewhat. That's true. I think two things stand out. Of course, authors always combine personalities, so it's not just one. So there's a combination of traits. And sometimes we take one person who has strong characteristics and we turn that into two characters so that different parts of the self can compete. But in Silhouette of Virtue, two characters who are involved in the crimes. One of them is based on a young man who I worked with in a hospital many years ago, who was there for rape. And it was unusual at that time, and still now, to have someone in the mental hospital only for rape. And he had a very pronounced personality, high intelligence, young African-American man, very manipulative, engaging. So he becomes sort of my theater professor in Silhouette of Virtue. But he's sort of split in half. So there's another part of him who is a white criminal. I don't want to give too much away about him, but the reality is I took this one person and sort of split in half. So that sort of thing happens. And then also the protagonist, the hero of the novel, Dr. Rivers, is based on someone I knew who on the opposite end, rather than being pathological personality, was sort of a more realized person, actualized person. And I was very interested in writing about these two extremes in the same novel. I have a question about how are you able to tell if a criminal is likely to be a repeat offender if set free? Well, that's a great question. That's what I get paid to do a lot. My career is based on that. But I think we, as psychologists, sort of a common sense notion that's true, that the best guide to future behavior is past behavior. So if the person has a history of certain sort of crime, and especially if the history of the severity of the crime is getting worse, then we we have a pretty good estimate they're going to do it again in the future. But we can also look at certain characteristics that the person might have. And the main characteristic that predicts future criminality is something called psychopathy, antisociality, or psychopathy. So we have people who are psychopaths. They're at the extreme end of psychopathy. We have antisocial personalities who are sort of in the middle. And we have your maybe gang members, intermittent practical criminals who are somewhere, closer toward the bottom. And then we have more normal people who still commit crimes. So in prisons, you have many normal people, but you have probably about maybe 30 to 40% of them are antisocial personality disorder, and about 20% are, or less, are psychopaths. So I would first want to know what they've done in the past and how psychopathic they are. Those are the first two things I'd want to know for predicting future crimes. With sex offenders, I want to know one other thing, which is how much deviant sexual arousal do they have, and how preoccupied have they been with sex over time. So it's a little different with the sex offender. I have a question that reads, refers to my blog on Psychology Today, and in that article, recent article, I call for APA expelling some psychologists who were involved in torture on the war on terror. And the question wants me to just explain the situation a bit. Two psychologists, the Senate Special Committee just reviewed enhanced interrogation methods that were used in the military during the Iraq War and generally on the war against terror. And they pinpointed two psychologists who were very actively involved in guiding and directing torture. And my views were really based on, one, torture is it's a moral absolute. It's something we believe through the tradition of philosophies that you don't do it. The tradition of Western philosophy, Kantian philosophy, those who are interested, is that this is just prohibited. It's not something that's done. And it's interesting that philosophy comes to that opinion, that point of view, whereas often religion does not come to that point of view. But that's the first thing. But the other is that they base their torture and their dissemination of torture methods on psychology. They use something called learned helplessness theory. And the theory itself is fine. And it's basically if you confine people or to a situation that they can't change over time, they learn that they can't do anything, so they become helpless. I experienced this myself going into prisons and jails and hospitals, where now I'll go to a door in such a facility and I'll just stand there waiting for the door to click, where the electronic, someone pushes a button, clicks, and then it'll open. Where sometimes I'll find, well, no, I could have opened the door, but I was sort of helpless. Well, they use that theory to basically say that if you make the detainees totally helpless, take every form of dignity or control, including controlling their bowel movements, what they could eat. You know by now that they took liquefied nutrients and forced these through their rectum instead of feeding them, so they didn't have any control of any aspect of their lives, body control. That if you did this, that they would then give you all total control, and they would tell you everything they knew. Of course, the problem with that is, the obvious one is, they tell you more than they know. They tell you what they believe you want to hear. So it's very ineffective. But these two psychologists made many millions of dollars designing a program based on a farce of a scientific theory with no basis. And their background, they had no background for really doing this at all. One of them had a dissertation on family therapy. So that's probably doesn't overlap with interrogation techniques, I hope. And they actually neither one of these two psychologists had ever interrogated anyone when they were put together this contract for the Defense Department. So my view of it is that these two psychologists and people like them really betrayed their mission, their oath as psychologists, to engage in this kind of activity. Now, there were other psychologists who were involved with that I think were misled by chain of command and just the desire to be patriotic. So not everybody, but I was referring to these two leaders. I've got a question here about what does my book, Silhouette of Virtue, show about race relations in the U.S. during the 1970s. Well, the 1970s was a time when, I think it's reflected in the book, when people were in change. They knew that things were going to change. The civil rights movement had some major successes, and the belief was that society would continue to change, that the different races in the United States would eventually fizzle away, and that the differences would disappear. But in the meantime, there was a great deal of conflict about how that worked out on the ground with people. And you also had many people, white and black, who tried to reach out to the other group but didn't have the skills or background to do that, and didn't have the experiential basis, didn't work together, didn't live near each other. So it was a time of hopefulness, a time that people wanted change, and it was also a time of reaction where some people were feeling like they were losing their bearings, especially with a combination of uproar generally in the society, which included the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, and feminism. These movements changed the basis of society, what you could predict and what you could feel comfortable with, and certainly race relations were part of that during the 70s. And I guess I would add that we're in a similar time. I believe that what we thought would happen with race isn't happening, and it's sort of throwing the basis of our predictions and our security off kilter. Many people feel, oh, we have a black president. Why do things like Ferguson persist? And I think that those kind of questions show the kind of uneasiness people will have about race now. So there's a question of how do you determine if a defendant is psychologically fit to stand trial? A little bit about the background of this. In the United States, you cannot be tried and found guilty if you're mentally incompetent. That means you don't understand what's going on in the trial, and you can't assist your attorneys to defend you, and you may not be able to understand the consequences of the trial. For example, if you believe that the judge is the devil, and that whatever your defense attorneys do, you will be found guilty, you are not competent to stand trial. If you believe that the judge is the devil, but you believe the devil can be pretty fair, he can be persuaded by the evidence, he just doesn't like you, he's just evil, then you might be competent. So you have to really very closely look at the skills and the knowledge and the attitude that are necessary to be in a trial. By attitude, I mean things like, can you have an open conversation with your attorneys? If you're paranoid about your attorneys, if you break out in angry, hostile fits every time the crime is talked about. I recently worked with someone who broke out into just massive tears whenever what he was accused of came up, to the point that he could not participate in the trial, but he could go about most of his day-to-day life. He could teach a class, for example, which he did, but as soon as someone addressed what he was charged with, he would just fall to pieces. So he was not competent. So that's basically what I do, is I'd be assessing not just does this person have mental illnesses or pathology, but what's the fit between that pathology and the specific skills, knowledge, and attitudes you need to be able to participate in a trial. I have a question about, have I ever considered writing a nonfiction book about my experiences? And the answer to that is really no. What I've done, though, is I have written textbooks. I've written a major textbook on substance abuse treatment back in 1993, I believe. called the Therapy of the Substance Abuse Syndromes. And I'd written, I'd say about a dozen book chapters. And in each of those cases, I would include cases. And often the cases in the chapters would include my experience with one or more patients or offenders or people being assessed. So in that sense, I've done that. I am interested now in writing sort of a semi-factual account of my year in Nigeria back in 1975. So it's similar past time period, but a time when it was unclear what the relations between Africa and African Americans would be, both in culture and in history. And I actually went there to try to find that out and taught English novel, African novel, English poetry, and African poetry there in Nigeria, West Africa. So I'm writing a book now about that. And it's sort of a combination of fiction, sort of an adventure novel, but also one that's exploring what it means for a young man to come of age, and what does it mean for these two multi-continental cultures, African diaspora. What does that mean for? What are the cultural implications for that? So that's something that's in the works now. So I have a question. Do you think killers and sex offenders represented on crime TV shows, and in movies are accurately represented? Well, yes and no. I think it depends on, which show you're watching. I think, of course, media of any kind and fiction, including my work, has to be interesting. It has to be suspenseful. And I sometimes say that even the psychopath, which people find most intriguing, when you spend a lot of time with psychopaths, you find that they can be boring. And by boring, I mean they're very, very predictable. When I interview most extreme psychopaths, I know a couple things are going to happen. They're going to try to take over the interview. They're going to want to be the most dominant person in the room. They're going to tell me lies that I easily can prove to be lies. And then when I challenge them on the lie, they're going to persist on that lie, or maybe shift it a little bit, but not give the truth. They're going to have a certain kind of emotional flatness, but nonetheless want to draw attention to themselves. So I think that in TV and in movies, you have to turn up the volume as you do in the novel. But in the novel, you can be a little bit more detailed, a lot more nuances, and therefore I think you can get closer to the reality without going to extremes just for sensationalism, or to keep the verve high. But I would say that unfortunately, almost anything you see depicted with mentally ill offenders and psychopathic offenders, anything you see depicted has probably happened, or something close to it, or something worse. So it's not in the extremity of the actual acts, it's in the perception that these acts happen all the time, and sometimes the psychology behind the specific offender doesn't match the offense that is shown in the program. I have a question which is asked, where did the title from this book come from? Did I have any other titles throwing around before I decided on Silhouette of Virtue? Well, yes, actually, my wife, who's an architect, volunteered Silhouette of Virtue. At the time, I was playing around with a title that was something like Face on the Water. It had this idea of reflection instead of silhouette, and illusion, and something that changes. And for those of you who have read Silhouette of Virtue, you know that there's a lot of nature scenes, and there's an important part of the book about the relationship between nature and humanity, and how we interface with it. So that was sort of my original idea. And I ended up landing on this because I think it was proposed by my wife. I think she captured the fact that the book really is about morality. It's about what is moral, and how morality can be faked. It can be simulated. And how do we turn, what is the true test to know what, even our own characters, to know if we're virtuous or we're not? So I actually really like the title. And so I take the good judgment of accepting a suggestion for the title. Someone makes a statement that they love my descriptive writing style. Thank you very much. You certainly have a way with words. Is your style influenced by any other authors in particular? I would say that yes. One in particular, I would probably say I would have to mention Ralph Ellison and The Invisible Man. Many people have read that book because there it's not just the descriptive style, it's the use of symbols and descriptions. I would also mention Charles Johnson, who wrote a book called Middle Passage, another book called Dreamer, who's highly descriptive. This book was directly influenced by John Gardner, who wrote a book about a university professor who becomes a sleuth. And Gardner's writing style, it has this combination of ability to be very descriptive and lyrical, but also directly to the point, sort of blunt and concrete at times. And I really would say that I would like to emulate that as well. So there's quite a few authors that I would say had an influence on the writing style of this book. There's a question about what forensic treatment is and what's available to people that have problems. Well, forensic treatment basically is treatment of people who have been involved in crimes and have been found either not guilty of those crimes because they're mentally ill, or that there's a mental health issue involved in their criminality overall. And there are quite a few treatments available. They're very similar to the treatments for people who are not criminal, who might, for example, have schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, where medication is very helpful, talk therapy is very helpful, group therapy, of course, sheltered living. But the difference with the forensic group is that it's very important to help them understand why they committed their crime, what were the antecedents, what came before, what were the triggers, what things about them that they won't be able to change, but we'll have to look at in the future so that these things don't reoccur. So for most people with severe mental illnesses, the focus is on the symptoms, controlling the symptoms, and then helping them to build a balanced life with the proper supports and use of medication and activities. For the forensic patient, there's this added thing about public safety. How do you keep them safe? And one aspect of that is really helping them deal with their specific past crimes and criminal tendencies that are related to their mental illness. We could mention really many different kinds of treatment, from anything from psychodrama, which can be very effective, but also potentially damaging, to medication, and of course individual one-on-one therapy for helping people understand why they've come to these problems. I have a question about what made me decide to start writing fiction. Did you always want to write? Well, I have to say yes. I think I remember in grade school I did some sort of acting up that led to my being forced to write hundreds of words. I had to write pages and pages of things, and instead I wrote a story about Jason and the Argonauts, my own version, and turned it in. The teacher wasn't very happy because it was supposed to be a punishment. But I've always wanted to write and to write fiction. For a while in my 20s and early 30s, I was interested in poetry, and I wrote quite a bit of poetry. And I don't write so much of that now. But I've always felt that fiction is, as an art, it is a talent or a gift that should be used by those people who think they may have it. but also it's an important form of knowledge. It's a way of that we get inside of other people's worlds, or try to, um, and start a dialogue about what those worlds are like. So I think it's an important thing to do, as well as something I've always been drawn toward. There's a question of how do I balance my time between writing and forensic psychology? Well, um, it's a difficult thing to do. Luckily, with both of them, I often can do my work at almost any time of day. With forensic psychology, I often have to do interviews, and depending on the phase of my career, I've spent a lot of years managing facilities. Managing facilities and being a clinical administrator over forensic hospital facilities or treatment prison facilities, very time demanding. But when you're finished at the end of the day or the end of the week, you want to get away from it. And oddly enough, writing fiction, even about offenders, is a way of getting away from those things about, like, trying to make sure that the soup is hot and the coleslaw is cold, and the elevator's running, and that the therapy groups are happening and run competently. So it's sort of an escapism, I guess I would say. But now in my career, I do a lot of evaluations for the court. I can do the record review and the analysis of tests, and much of the writing, all writing. I can do that pretty much anywhere, anytime. And what's really more structured is interviewing and testing offenders or other people who have problems. I do some work with attorneys who have run into problems, and so I have to meet with them, of course, to spend time. And then there's time that I might appear in court. So that's more structured time. But the good thing about it is, in all the activities I'm doing, I feel like I'm collecting more material for the writing. And I think all of you know this is what writers do, is that almost everything they do, they're thinking, well, this is going to be, this is good grist for the mill. It's going to show up somewhere if it's at all interesting. Someone wants me to talk a bit about the fictional parallel and what my writing process is like. I've never been a writer who really works strictly to an outline. This is one of the issues of an outline. But I usually envision a character in motion, and usually very quickly I want to get that character in interaction with another character and a conflict. So once I've got that, and this is sort of literature 101 or fiction 101. Once I have that, the characters and the action start to evolve. I also am looking for rhythm. I'm looking for a rhythm in those early interactions, and I'm looking for hidden for images in my fantasy and in my writing that are hidden symbols for themes. So I'm looking for themes, but not so much. So I think I'll write about justice. I'm looking for something in the interaction that points to a theme. It might point to justice. For example, there might be an early scene, a character who's sort of whining, and I notice as I write about the whining that it's really an issue of justice that the person is concerned about. One second, please. Right. Sorry. All right, I'm back on. Someone asked, am I going to write another fiction book? And I'd say yes. I'm thinking about writing a sequel